We would like to send out a special thanks to Sock Club for supporting The Trail Went Cold. And we would like to thank you, the listeners, by offering you the chance to earn 15% off your next order of socks when you visit sockclub.com/cold and use the discount code COLD. That's sockclub.com/cold and the discount code is COLD. Enjoy the show.
Christmas Eve, 1931, Superior, Arizona. While driving through the desert, a couple named Ed and Julia Stewart experience a flat tire and pull over to a remote spot. They soon discover an abandoned newborn baby girl inside a hatbox and turn her over to the authorities. When the child's family cannot be located, she is adopted out to a couple whose identities are kept a secret from the public. Over 50 years later, a woman named Sharon Elliott is shocked to learn that she was the mysterious Hatbox Baby. But in spite of her best attempts to uncover her past, the identity of Sharon's real family, and the story of how she wound up in the desert remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our newest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and that voice you just heard narrate our opening was our latest contest winner, Jonathan Burroughs. As you probably know, we now have a recurring monthly contest where our listeners can earn a chance to recite the opening narration for one of our podcast episodes. Jonathan won our monthly drawing last month, and did an amazing job, so a big thanks to him. If you haven't already entered this contest, I will be sharing more details about how you can do so at the end of this episode. Anyway, throughout the month of December, The Trail Went Cold has been covering some cases which took place around Christmas time, but since today will be our final episode before Christmas, I've decided to do something a little different from the norm and cover a rather upbeat mystery. Well, as upbeat as a podcast about unsolved cold cases can possibly get. There are some tragic elements to this story, but it is strangely inspiring at the same time, and most importantly, there is no violent crime here. And considering that our final episode before Christmas last year was the disappearance of the Sodder children, this story is practically a Hallmark movie by comparison. Today, we will be exploring the saga of the Hatbox Baby, an abandoned newborn baby girl who was discovered inside a hatbox in the middle of the Arizona desert on Christmas Eve. The girl would be adopted out, and go on to live a very good life as Sharon Elliott until she finally learned her origin story over 50 years later. Of course, Sharon then wanted to find out who her real family was, but never uncovered any conclusive answers, and there is debate about whether Sharon's story was a true Christmas miracle or an elaborate setup. This was featured as a Lost Love segment on Unsolved Mysteries exactly 28 years ago today, and while you'd ordinarily never see me feature a Lost Loves case on The Trail Went Cold, this story is so intriguing that I'm willing to make an exception. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unresolved saga of the Hatbox Baby. Our story begins in Arizona on Christmas Eve in 1931. A young married couple, 21-year-old Ed Stewart, and his wife, 18-year-old Julia, decided to leave their home in Mesa to take a 70-mile trip to the town of Globe with Julia's 15-year-old twin cousins, John and Betty Mansfield. Their plan was to go into the Pinal Mountains and see some rare snow which had fallen there. By the time nightfall hit, the weather had become very chilly, and at around 8 p.m., the Stewarts were driving home when their car suffered a flat tire and they were forced to pull over to a remote spot in the middle of the desert, about 10 miles west of the small town of Superior. According to Julia, while waiting for her husband to change the tire, she decided to stretch her legs and took a walk out into the desert when she suddenly came across a pasteboard lady's hatbox about 150 feet away from the car. Julia could hear a whimpering sound from inside the box and wondered if it might contain an animal of some sort. But when she opened the lid, Julia was treated to a shocking sight. A newborn baby girl was inside. The child had red hair and blue eyes, was wearing flower pajamas, and had been wrapped in a blue blanket. Once the Stewarts fixed their car, they immediately drove back home to Mesa and took the baby to the police station. The child was then temporarily placed in a maternity home in the town of Florence and given the name Baby Marion while the authorities attempted to figure out what to do. Marion was examined by a doctor and determined she was likely around a week old. But in spite of being found in the harsh conditions of the desert, she was still in very good health, so she had probably not been out there very long before the Stewarts discovered her. The police performed an extensive search of the desert outside of Superior, but found no clues to indicate who might have abandoned baby Marion there. When the press got wind of this story, it made national news and became a media sensation. The child was dubbed the Hatbox Baby, and given that the country was suffering through the Great Depression at that time, the idea of a helpless newborn baby being rescued from certain death in the middle of the desert on Christmas Eve seemed like a true miracle. The story became a symbol of hope for millions of people, some of whom went out of their way to send Christmas gifts and donations to baby Marion. However, all attempts to figure out who the Hatbox Baby's family might be or how she wound up in the desert went nowhere. As a result, baby Marion was put up for adoption. A total of 17 couples applied to adopt the child, and a hearing was scheduled at the Pinal County Courthouse in Florence on February 16, 1932. But as fate would have it, only 2 couples made it to the courthouse that day because of bad weather, narrowing the field considerably. Of the 2 couples, one of them already had children, so the judge found it only fair to award custody of the Hatbox Baby to Faith and Henry Steig, who hailed from the town of Prescott. However, there was a vested interest to protect the privacy of the child, so the judge ordered the adoption records to be sealed and requested that the press not reveal the couple's names. The Steigs stated that they were planning to change baby Marion's name in order to raise her as their own, so the public never got to learn the new identity of the Hatbox Baby. While the story faded from the spotlight, people still remembered it, and every several years or so, new articles about the Hatbox Baby would be published around Christmas time, and they'd often speculate about what happened to her and what kind of life she was currently leading. As an example, a 30th anniversary article published in the Arizona Republic in 1961 contained this quote: "She is now 30 years old, and quietly beautiful, they say, a woman of exceptional grace and purity, living somewhere in Arizona." It seemed like no one would ever find out what happened to the Hatbox Baby until a 54-year-old woman named Sharon Elliott learned a shocking secret in 1986. For the first 8 years of her life, Sharon had lived in the town of Prescott before her family moved to California. Sharon's parents divorced when she was still young, and she was raised by her mother, Faith Morrow, who eventually got remarried. When she grew up, Sharon got married herself and had a daughter while working as a secretary and contracting administrator for an aerospace firm. By 1986, Sharon's father and stepfather had both passed away, and her mother was battling breast cancer. At the time, Sharon's daughter and son-in-law had moved from California to Mesa, Arizona, and after retiring, Sharon was planning to move there herself to be closer to them. Well, now that Sharon was going to be living in Mesa, this made Faith Morrow paranoid that her daughter might end up learning a big secret from her past, and since she didn't have much time left, Faith decided it would be best to share this secret with Sharon herself. So in August of that year, Faith finally confessed to Sharon that she was not her biological mother and had adopted her when she was 2 months old, after she was discovered abandoned in the desert and made headlines as the infamous Hatbox Baby. Needless to say, this revelation took Sharon by complete surprise, as she had never even heard of the Hatbox Baby story before. Faith soon passed away, but also told Sharon she had given a sealed envelope containing all the documents related to her adoption to a quote-unquote dear friend, but they had been destroyed. However, Sharon was still determined to find out who her biological family was. In 1988, she took her story to the local newspaper, who published it on Christmas Eve that year, and it was picked up by a wire service and published all over the country. Sharon soon teamed up with Orphan Voyage, an organization dedicated to helping adults track down their biological families. An investigator with Orphan Voyage named Alice Simon helped Sharon gain access to the court records about her case, which were unsealed for the first time in 57 years. By the end of 1989, the case would gain national exposure again when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. Naturally, the segment generated a lot of tips, including from some people who claimed they were Sharon's birth mother. One man even got into contact with Sharon and said he was her biological brother, but the problem was that he also believed he was the Lindbergh baby as well. None of these leads panned out, and failed to uncover any conclusive information about who Sharon's birth family might be. At the time the Unsolved Mystery segment aired, the current whereabouts of Ed and Julia Stewart were unknown, but Alice Simon was able to track them down and question them about the night they discovered Sharon in the desert. After looking at documentation of their original court testimony, Sharon had become skeptical about the Stewart story and found it unbelievable that they could have just stumbled upon an abandoned baby by pure chance in the middle of an isolated desert, and the Unsolved Mystery segment did not hesitate to express this skepticism. According to Simon, the Stewarts had faced skepticism from law enforcement from day one and seemed pretty bitter about it, and were also none too happy that the Hatbox Baby saga was back in the spotlight again several decades later. But they still stuck to their original story and maintained it was true. Simon also eventually tracked down Betty Mansfield, though tragically, her twin brother John had been killed in a motorcycle accident in 1945. Believe it or not, Betty claimed to have no memory at all of any incident where she found a baby in the desert. Both Betty and the Stewarts have since passed away and never revealed any new information. Naturally, the most logical explanation was that the Stewarts had fabricated their story in order to protect the reputation of someone who had recently given birth to Sharon. During the 1930s, if a woman had a child out of wedlock, it would have been considered the most scandalous thing ever, so this could have been motive for the Stewarts to orchestrate a fictitious scenario where they just happened to stumble across an abandoned baby. Well, this theory would gain more traction when Sharon dug deeper into the case. Remember how Faith Morrow claimed that she had given an envelope containing all the documents about Sharon's adoption to a quote-unquote dear friend, and that they'd been destroyed? Well, it turned out this envelope had not actually been destroyed, but simply misplaced, and Sharon eventually got her hands on it and made some surprising discoveries. For starters, there was a note in Faith's handwriting in which she wrote that her dear friend was actually Sharon's first cousin. While she was in her 40s, Sharon had actually remembered meeting this woman, who had red hair and seemed to bear a striking resemblance to her. However, all attempts to track this woman down went nowhere. On this same note, Faith had also written that Sharon's biological mother was a woman named Edna Sherman Rowe, who died in a plane crash in 1949. The envelope also contained another note in Faith's handwriting, which read, 1935, your mother saw you. She was 21 then. Anyway, an investigation into the background of Edna Sherman Rowe showed that she actually did exist and was killed in a plane crash near Odessa, Texas at the age of 35, though the crash occurred in June of 1951, not 1949 as the note claimed. Edna had originally been born in Oklahoma, and Alice Simon was able to obtain a photograph of her, but did not believe Edna had much of a resemblance to Sharon. Simon was also able to track down some of Edna's living relatives, but none of them remembered her ever giving birth to a child. In 2010, one of Edna's nieces was tracked down in Tucson and initially consented to DNA testing. However, she later changed her mind, so the testing has never been done. Every few years, new articles are published about the Hatbox Baby in the Arizona media around Christmas time, and Sharon has often been interviewed to share her story. While I can't 100% verify this, I believe Sharon is still alive today at the age of 86. But unfortunately, she has never found out who her birth parents are, and the full origin story of the Hatbox Baby remains unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our new sponsor, Sock Club, as we are very excited that they are now supporting The Trail Went Cold. The holidays are right around the corner, and Sock Club is delivering the perfect gift experience. This is a good time to remind your loved ones that you care each month with quality, American-made socks. The socks are sent straight to your door, featuring a different modern classic design each month that is perfect to add sophisticated fun to any wardrobe. Each package also contains a personalized gift message that can be customized each month. I am pleased to say that I am now teamed up with Sock Club, and they are offering us all 15% off. If you want to give a little reminder of your love every month, then give Sock Club. I just received a shipment of new socks from Sock Club, and it's a good thing too, because we have some pretty cold Canadian winters up here, and I desperately needed them. Before this, my drawer was filled with nothing but plain old boring worn down black socks, but thanks to Sock Club, I'm going to spend my lead up to Christmas wearing socks which are not only extremely warm and comfortable, but also very vibrant and colorful and will help put me into the holiday spirit. So if you want to experience the same thing, take advantage of our special offer and go to sockclub.com/cold and get 15% off when you use the discount code COLD. That's sockclub.com/cold and you use the discount code COLD for 15% off. Thank you and enjoy the rest of our episode. So yes, this is a much different story than you're used to hearing on The Trail Went Cold, and I have to admit that I'm a total sucker for this one. Either this is one of the most remarkable Christmas miracles of all time, or it was a very elaborate con job, and everyone involved managed to stay silent about it for several decades. I think one of the reasons the story of the Hatbox Baby still garners interest after all this time is because Sharon Elliott genuinely seems like one of the sweetest people on the planet. I can't imagine how much of a shocker it would be to live an ordinary life for over 50 years and then suddenly learn that not only were you adopted by your family, but you were supposedly found abandoned in the middle of the desert and spent the first 2 months of your life being one of the biggest news stories in the United States. Yet from what I've seen of her in interviews, Sharon has always maintained a positive attitude about the whole thing. It must be incredibly frustrating to not know where you actually came from, but she has never seemed bitter about it, and is very thankful that she got to live such a wonderful life. This story is also a very interesting time capsule of a much different era, and it's interesting to look back and see how a story could go viral back in the days of the Great Depression. How the world is still a much different place than when this story was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989. It's so weird looking back at their lost love segments today. In that pre-internet age, the best chance people had of finding lost loved ones was to go on national television, whereas today, they could probably just find them by typing their names into Google or Facebook. It's also quite remarkable to look at the details of the Hatbox Baby's adoption, as the judge asked the media to respect the child's privacy and not divulge the names of her adoptive parents, and for the most part, they actually complied. Yes, I did uncover a few newspaper articles from late 1932 which mentioned Faith and Henry Steig's names, but it wasn't enough exposure to prevent them from raising their child in complete secrecy for the next 5 decades. Needless to say, if something like this happened today in the age of the internet and social media, I'm sure the Steigs' identities would leak out there somehow, and the poor couple would probably have to go into witness protection in order to maintain any privacy for their child. Hilariously enough, the details of this story are kinda similar to how Jonathan and Martha Kent discovered baby Superman inside a space capsule when he arrived on Earth from planet Krypton. Superman's origin story was written only a few years later, and even though this was never officially confirmed, I've always wondered if the Hatbox Baby inspired it. When I look at old newspaper articles about the case, I don't really see the media expressing much skepticism about Ed and Julia Stewart's story, which would probably happen if this situation occurred today, though the Stewarts did claim they faced a lot of skepticism from law enforcement at that time. I think this was probably due to the fact that the Hatbox Baby happened to be found in the desert on Christmas Eve, so believing she was rescued from certain death really played into the whole Christmas miracle angle. If this had occurred at any other time of year, I think people might have dug a little deeper in order to pick things apart. Given that it was the Great Depression, this was the type of hopeful story people needed, so everyone pretty much went along with it. I really hate to say it, but when you look at this story through a modern lens, the odds of a couple just happening to come across a baby in the middle of the Arizona desert are beyond astronomical. This occurred about 10 miles west of the town of Superior, which has a population of less than 3,000 people today, so I can only imagine how small it was back in 1931. If you look up Superior on Google Maps today, there is literally nothing surrounding the town but vast, empty desert. This is pretty much the working definition of the middle of nowhere. If the Stewarts happened to come across the baby lying by the side of the road while they were driving, that would be one thing. But no, they got a flat tire, pulled over, and then Julia decided to stroll about 150 feet away to the exact spot where an abandoned baby in a hat box just happened to be. And given that it was a cold night, and a doctor determined that the child was in good health, she really couldn't have been out there that long. Meaning that after someone else drove out to this desolate spot in the middle of nowhere and abandoned a child, a second car just happened to come along and stop at that exact same spot a very short time later. If the Stewart story is true, then this would have to be one of the most astounding coincidences in human history. So unless the Hatbox was a spacecraft and Sharon had just arrived from Krypton, I have to think this story did not go the way it has been described. In Ed and Julia Stewart's defense, they never changed their story or stopped maintaining it was true until their deaths. Like I said earlier, the most prominent theory is that the baby was born to an unwed mother, and the Stewarts fabricated a story about discovering an abandoned child in order to protect the mother's reputation. Now, by the time the Stewarts were questioned by Alice Simon in the early 1990s, there was no longer the same social stigma attached to unmarried women having children, and given all the notoriety this story obtained, why wouldn't the Stewarts have just come clean after all this time? After all, that's what Sharon's adoptive mother decided to do when she was dying of cancer. You might think that there's no logical reason for the Stewarts to have taken this secret to their graves, but the fact of the matter is, people do that sort of thing. Believe it or not, one of the most infamous examples of this involves Jack Nicholson. In the mid-1970s, Nicholson learned that the people whom he believed were his mother and father were actually his grandparents, and that the woman he believed was his sister was actually his biological mother. When she was still a teenager, Jack's so-called sister had gotten pregnant and given birth to Jack, but since this was 1937, and children born out of wedlock was still the biggest taboo ever, her parents decided to raise Jack as their own son and let him believe his real mother was his sibling. By the time Nicholson found this out, both his grandparents and his mother had already passed away without ever telling him the full truth, so this was definitely a secret that everyone involved was willing to take to their graves. So I envision a similar scenario with the Hatbox Baby, and do not find it too surprising that Ed and Julia Stewart might have been willing to keep their knowledge about Sharon's true identity a secret, even after they learned she was looking for answers. But the big question is, if the Stewarts fabricated the entire story, how would this situation unfold? Well, it is pretty suspicious that when Betty Mansfield was interviewed, she was unable to recall any incident where her cousin discovered an abandoned baby in the desert, which you'd think would be a pretty memorable moment in your life. However, I will concede that Betty was not questioned about it until over 60 years after the fact, and she would have been an elderly woman by then, so it is possible she legitimately did not remember it. But it's also possible she doesn't remember the incident because it never actually happened. One theory is that the whole thing was staged, and that John and Betty Mansfield were there to act as witnesses when the Stewarts pulled over and happened to stumble upon an abandoned baby which had been placed there earlier by someone else for them to find. However, I'm pretty doubtful about this because this was a remote barren desert at night in the middle of nowhere, and if the baby was deliberately planted there for the Stewarts, the odds are not good that they would have been able to pinpoint the exact correct spot to pull over. During their original court testimony, the Stewarts claimed that during their trip to the Pinal Mountains and Globe that day, the only other stop they made was in the town of Roosevelt, which, if you look at the route from Mesa to Globe, is kinda out of their way. So some people believe that the Stewarts might have made this trip to Roosevelt in order to pick up the baby. On the surface, the Stewart story about wanting to take the Mansfield twins into the mountains on Christmas Eve to see snow is not that far-fetched, but the thing which seems odd is that Ed and Julia had their own 8-month baby at that time, whom they left with a babysitter the entire day. You'd think that most parents would be inclined to be with their child on their very first Christmas Eve, rather than taking a 70-mile trip to the mountains. But it doesn't sound like a tangible connection was ever made between the Stewarts and any young women who might have given birth to an illegitimate child around that time. The baby was already about a week old by the time she was turned over to the police, so if an unwed teenage girl gave birth to her, then her family must have done a really effective job of keeping her pregnancy under wraps in order to prevent people from wondering what happened to her newborn child. Or maybe this is one of those cases where everyone in the community knew about what happened, but kept their mouths shut about it. Either way, even though the story garnered a lot of publicity at the time, I don't think anyone ever came forward to point the authorities towards someone who might have been the child's mother. But what's very intriguing is that several decades later, the discovery of Faith Morrow's sealed envelope of documents uncovered a name of a promising candidate, Edna Sherman Rowe. Newspaper articles did confirm this woman died in a plane crash in 1951 at the age of 35, so if she is Sharon's mother and gave birth to her out of wedlock at the age of 15, then that would have been very scandalous at that time. However, it doesn't look like they've ever turned up any tangible evidence that Ed and Julia Stewart knew Edna Sherman Rowe or would have had any reason to orchestrate a hoax to protect her. But there is a big question of how Faith Morrow learned Edna's name to begin with, and if she might have known more about Sharon's identity than she revealed. What we do know is that Faith claimed that she turned over those documents to a quote-unquote dear friend who may have actually been Sharon's first cousin. In fact, Sharon actually met this woman on one occasion, and they thought they had a resemblance. But how would Faith have known Sharon's cousin to begin with? Well, there are two possibilities here. Number one, Faith did her own investigative work to find out who Sharon's biological family was, got in touch with Sharon's first cousin, but decided not to reveal any details to Sharon until she was dying of cancer. Or number two, Faith was in on this whole setup from the very beginning. Apparently, Faith and Henry Steig had trouble having children of their own, which is why they decided to adopt. If they happened to know a family with a pregnant, unwed teenager who were hoping to cover up the child's existence, then this could have been an elaborate plan for the Steigs to obtain a child of their own. The Stewarts concoct a story about finding an abandoned baby girl in the desert, the child is put up for adoption, the Steigs apply for custody, and even though 17 couples do the same thing because of the publicity the case received, the Steigs win the luck of the draw, legally adopt the child, and get to raise her as their very own. 5 decades later, Faith decides that she wants her daughter to know the truth about her being adopted, but she still wants to protect the identity of Sharon's biological family and decides not to tell her the full story. So could Sharon's real mother have been Edna Sherman Rowe? Well, I could go either way on this. On one hand, Edna's niece initially agreed to DNA testing, but then changed her mind, which might be an indication that she still wants to protect this big family secret. On the other hand, Sharon and Alice Simon have seen a photograph of Edna and do not believe there is any resemblance. But if Edna is not Sharon's mother, then how does she fit into this story? Simon has theorized that at some point, Faith could have randomly come across a news article about Edna Sherman Rowe's death in a plane crash, and then decided to put a romantic spin on her daughter's story. She dreamed up some elaborate fantasy where Edna was Sharon's real mother, even though it had no basis in reality. That might be the reason Faith never mentioned Edna's name to Sharon, as Faith possibly had no idea who Sharon's mother actually was. And one other thing which might lean away from the idea of Edna being the mother is Faith's handwritten note in her envelope which read, 1935, your mother saw you, she was 21 then. Well, if you do the math, Edna Sherman Rowe would not have been 21 years old in 1935. But you have to wonder if there's any truth to this message. Since all the details about the adoption were sealed and kept secret from the public, would Sharon's biological mother even have been able to find out who her adoptive parents were and track her child down to see her? Under normal circumstances, I'd probably say no, unless the Steigs already knew who she was beforehand and allowed her to visit Sharon. If the mother was in fact 21 years old at that time, then it probably wasn't Edna Sherman Rowe. Sharon's real mother might have been some other 21-year-old woman, but Faith kept her identity a secret, and Edna Sherman Rowe is just a complete fabrication she dreamed up in order to protect someone else. Overall, I couldn't provide you with a definitive answer about where Sharon Elliott came from, but as much as I'd love to believe the whole Christmas miracle story about this abandoned baby being rescued in the desert, I just can't buy it. I believe the story was a hoax, but it captivated the public so much that most people didn't bother to question it at that time. But whatever the truth, the important thing is that the child ultimately wound up being raised by a loving family, grew up into a very nice woman, and lived a happy, successful life of which she seems to have no regrets. However, everyone should have the right to know where they came from, and I'm sure Sharon would still love to find out, even if the truth might turn out to be a lot darker than anticipated. Given all the time that's passed, it seems very unlikely we'll ever know the whole story. But if by some miracle you happen to have any information about the discovery of the Hatbox Baby or Sharon Elliott's true identity, please contact the appropriate authorities. As we bring this episode to a close, I want to send out another special thanks to Jonathan Burroughs for his stellar job at reciting the opening narration. Like I mentioned in the intro, I have now made it a recurring monthly contest for our listeners to win the opportunity to do the same thing. If you've already entered this contest before, you are still eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter the contest and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. I need to provide my thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes our eerie score and even came up with a nice, ominous Christmassy tune for this episode. I also need to send out a special thanks to the very talented Esther Gamas, who did the amazing cover art for today's episode. Esther has done cover art for a couple of our episodes this year, including our first-year anniversary show, and she always knocks it out of the park. I have provided links to Esther's Facebook and Tumblr pages in our episode description, so you can check out her other amazing work. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself and your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. Just one more reminder that if you're looking to purchase some new socks for the winter, please check out our new sponsor, Sock Club, and you'll receive a 15% discount if you visit the website sockclub.com/cold and use the promo code COLD. If you use their product, you'll never again have to utter those horrifying words, "The feet went cold." And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're in the Christmas spirit and want to generously donate to our podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed hearing our final Christmas-themed episode, and I wish every one of you a very safe and happy holidays. And not to worry, even though next Wednesday is only 2 days after Christmas, we are still planning to release one final episode as scheduled to close out 2017. So once again, have yourself a wonderful holiday season. Join me next Wednesday for this year's final new episode of The Trail Went Cold.